Thank you. During the 2013 Biennale di Venezia, a performance entitled La Lontananza, 21st Century Cori Spezzati, or Divided Choirs, programmed Luigi Nono's 1989 work for violin and electronics, La Lontananza Nostalgico-Utopica Futura, Madrigale per più camminantes con Gideon Kramer, quite a mouthful, with Claudio Monteverdi's Oimè dove il mio ben for two sopranos, and Continuo. A nostalgic continuity of thought is expressed by the coupling of these works composed roughly 400 years apart by two composers who called Venice home. Under the banner of Divided Choirs, both composers' interest in the spatialization of sound was here thematized, mediated, and updated through the use of wave field synthesis and a 192 loudspeaker system. Monteverdi's 1619 madrigal was renovated. Soprano Roberta Marnelli performed an ethereal duet with her own pre-recorded vocal track and virtual Thierbo Continuo, capitalizing on the technology's ability to transcend the acoustic limitations of the performance space. Nono's La Lontananza was similarly enhanced, with the specter of Gideon Kramer's disembodied violin improvisations meandering around Barbara Luneberg's live timbral inflections. With chairs situated in a square at the center of a dimly lit Teatro Letese, the audience experienced a dynamic soundscape formed by the succession and superimposition of acoustic and electronic timbres in perpetual transformation over time and in space. I began by relaying some general aspects of this recent concert, not only to evidence continued interest in a relatively obscure piece by Nono, but also to offer a glimpse into some of the techniques and aesthetic interests that preoccupied the composer late in his career. Without denying the conceptual line that runs through Nono's entire musical output, after the composition of his 1960 string quartet Fragmente Stile and Diotima, a late style does emerge. Defined by an emphasis on silence and pauses, the juxtaposition of fragments in which pianissimi verging on the imperceptible alternate with explosions of sound, and the placing of structural value on space, this svolta, or turning point, resulted from Nono's experiencing an inexplicable silence and a feeling that he no longer had adequate means to express himself. Indeed, La Lontananza was conceived in what was a tumultuous period for Nono, as he was coping with the death of his parents, developing a close relationship with Venetian statesman and philosopher Massimo Cacciari, reevaluating the nature of his political engagement in the face of striking blows to the far left, and possibly feeling the rumblings of a postmodern concept. Following musicologist Jean-Mario Borio's provocation that analysis follow the philosophical horizon outlined by the technical structures of music, this paper will provide a brief inspection of how Nono constructs space in La Lontananza and how this construction projects a sense of non-linear temporality. My analysis is amplified by Jonathan D. Kramer's model for inspecting time as a multivalent construction rather than a pre-existing receptacle. Further, I propose that the aesthetic emerging from these techniques intersects directly with the philosophical theories of history proposed by Cacciari and Walter Benjamin, two thinkers whose ideas were influential in Nono's late work. Although simple homologies between thought and composition should always be approached with caution, testimony evidence from Nono supports this conflation of concept and musical product. Finally, I will inspect how the projection of alternative modes of time and an evocation of space function within a putative condition of postmodernity. In numerous sources, including his off-cited 1959 Darmstadt lecture, The Historical Presence of Music Today, Nono makes two important assertions, both of which are crucial to understanding the relationship between his musical language and its function in a broader social context. First, he states that there must be a mutual interpenetration of concept and technique. And second, that a work, by nature of its production at a given historical moment, has a vital power to contribute to the time in which it originated and to become a testament to its time. Nono sought to produce an ethical testimony to the here and now, which he considered to be an inherently political act of freedom in a broader process of transformation of the social reality. Or, as the composer said, there is no doubt that a score has no more chance of causing a revolution than a picture, a poem, or a book. But music, just like a picture, poem, or book, can testify to the desolate state of society, can contribute, can be the basis for awareness, if its technical attributes maintain the same level as the ideological ones. Thus, even if in La Lontananza the listener is not confronted with any explicit textual reference to political engagement, The piece's specific performance at a specific moment in time using specific up-to-date technology is, per se, political, according to Nono. La Lontananza was first conceived after a meeting between violinist Gidon Kremer and Luigi Nono at the experimental studio der Heinrich Strobel Stiftung in Freiburg in 1988. The two agreed to collaborate on a new work based on Kremer's recorded improvisations. Nono instructed him to resist the urge to slip into the kinds of formulaic passages that tend to enter a performer's extemporaneous playing and focus instead on creating a variety of spacious timbres. The sounds Nono selected from the 5 hours of resulting tape serve as the electronic component to be played in tandem with the live violinist. In a live setting, the sound engineer sends signals from each of the 8 channels to the corresponding 8 loudspeakers positioned around the perimeter of the performance space, being careful never to activate all at once and feeling free to modify their intensities and incorporate silences as desired. So you can see these channels here. Usually they would be coupled, so 1 and 2 would be environmental sounds, and 3 and 4 would be something else that's recorded. And to the right, you see the spatial layout of the various loudspeakers. So that's how it would work, and the sound engineer would be able to modify that. In a live setting, Nono's direction that at no time should this be a concerto for violin and electronics places both performers on equal footing, their spontaneous interactions forming the lifeblood of the work. Pages of the solo violinist score are placed on 6 music stands positioned around and within the audience. The music for each stand is numbered 1 to 6, and no 2 sequential numbers are to be placed adjacently. The desired effect is to have the performer searching out each stand. Further, this wandering can be complicated by the addition of 2 to 4 more stands with music. The electronic component begins before the violinist appears on stage and continues after the performer leaves. The caminantes, or travelers or wanderers, of the work's title are manifested in the physical path chosen by the live performer, the numerous paths of sound that the sound engineer can control, and the inclusion of indeterminate procedures. 5 of Nono's last 7 works draw on the theme of the caminante, the subject of an Antonio Machado poem, which Nono found excerpted on the wall of a monastery in Toledo, Spain in 1985. The inscription read, "Caminantes, no hay caminos, hay que caminar." Travelers, there is no path, there is only the traveling. In a 1987 interview, Nono elaborates that it is the wanderer of Nietzsche, of the ongoing search, of Cacciari's Prometheus. It is the sea across which one travels to create, to discover the route. The composer claims that his works are to a degree a musical transformation of his social experiences. So La Lontananza's genesis from a meeting with Kremer falls directly in line with this compositional process. I'll now turn to the aforementioned Biennale performance and then to the score to demonstrate how this works. Nono creates an environment in which the audience is immersed in sounds that are constantly changing in terms of their medium, electronic or live, timbre, dynamics, and source. And indeed, without a visual aid, it becomes incredibly difficult to distinguish electronic from acoustic sounds. Audience members, who certainly play an active role in the work's realization, must continuously negotiate their perceptual faculties through time and space. Steve Wertzler, writing within the context of sound studies, diagrams 4 different spatial temporal performance situations made possible by the use of pre-recorded material. A schematic that to a degree elaborates Benjamin's ideas surrounding the aura and reproducibility. Using this model, 3 modes are activated simultaneously during a performance of La Lontananza. The live soloist remains in position 1, while the electronic component is situated in position 4 as something that's recorded and played back. However, slippage into position 3, which Wertzler associates with limp syncing, is also possible, as the line between spatial absence and spatial co-presence can become blurred when the violinist's gestures and movements seem commensurate with sounds issuing from the recording. And you may have noticed in the clip that I showed you, as she goes to bow the violin, she makes a sound and then stops, but we still hear sound. We still hear the electronic component. So that's an example of this slippage. The trace of Gidon Kremer's recording, as it haunts the live performance through the electronic medium, is implied in Nono's title, that is, La Lontananza Nostalgica, as a nostalgic memory brought from a temporal and spatial distance into the present. In a 1988 interview, Nono was asked by Paolo Patazzi to elaborate on his use of Nostalgica Futura for his title, and whether this alluded to a more complex, non-conventional conception of time. Nono's response reveals a great deal about the foundational ideas concerning past, present, and future from which La Lontananza emerged, and is worth quoting at length. Future should not be understood in a prophetic sense, but in the present. In living every moment of today, one discovers and establishes new relationships with yesterday, the day before yesterday, and the past. The distance that is made more and more distant until it is regarded as past is at the same time simultaneous presence. For example, the quality of the sound of Gidon Kremer, that is continuously mobile, maximally aerial, and dematerialized. For me, it is always more important to cross over beyond scholastic, dogmatic, and rigidly circumscribed frameworks outside of oneness and univocality, attempting to open up not only to today, not only to new technology, but to rediscover aspects of the past in a new way, to change the conception of time and space. Different times can establish amongst themselves newer and newer relationships. Nono's statement recalls Benjamin's notion of a weak messianic power with which each generation is endowed. Benjamin implies that present revolutions redeem or continue past revolutions, and that there is a line connecting them, which is not that of linear time. Benjamin goes on to claim that the idea of progress is inseparable from the idea of homogeneous empty time. The transformation of history does not occur in homogeneous empty time, rather it occurs in moments of immediacy, Jetztzeit, that blast particular moments of the present and past out of linear sequence, and presumably the order of fate. Moreover, the present is not a transition between moments, because time originates and reaches a standstill in the experience of the present. Instead of an eternal past depicted as linear, we need a ruptural experience of particular moments that stand out, and this suggests an expressive relationship to temporal experience. As opposed to Marxist theories of history, which rely on lists of dates, Benjamin and Cacciari, they construct time from structure. From Benjamin, structure is based on the idea of a messianic 0 hour in which thought concentrates into a monad, and this messianic moment explodes particular epochs, lives, or works out of linear history. It is telling that David Harvey's monograph, The Condition of Postmodernity, ends with a series of chapters on the conflation of space and time within the postmodern. Harvey cites Frederick Jameson's conception of the postmodern shift to a crisis in our experience of space and time, a crisis in which spatial categories come to dominate temporal ones, while themselves undergoing a mutation with which we cannot keep pace. Further, Harvey insists that we recognize the multiplicity of the objective qualities that space and time can express, as well as the role of human practices in their construction. Benjamin's notion of nonlinear history was featured extensively, both textually and formally, in Nono's 1986 dramatic work, Prometheus, for which Cacciari was the librettist. La Lontananza is driven by these ideas as well, and a look at the score will reveal Nono's composing out of nonlinear elements. Although the music written for each stand is unique, music stand 1 may be taken as paradigmatic. The first 4 measures alone contain a surfeit of dynamic variation, extended techniques, for example, on the fingerboard with the frog, on the bridge with the hair only, extended fermatas and expressive indications. Other sections, not shown here, indicate that the performer should apply wholesale oscillations of pitch of up to 1/16 of a tone at will. Repetitions of the same pitch performed in different ways lend the piece a sense of stasis, yet the sounds remain dynamic through their continued evolution. In a sense, Nono and the performer are engaged in an unspoken exchange during the performance, an idea that has been confirmed by some performers and is enhanced by the score's typography. The pitch material indicated in the score, which again is in constant flux through timbral variation, exhibits great variation in register and moves across intervals of all types, with tritones, perfect fourths, fifths, and major and minor seconds dominating. Nono also exploits the harmonic capabilities of the violin with double and triple stops that often highlight the same intervals. All of these techniques fail to give the listener any impression of connectivity. We are left with moments of barely audible, sustained pitches juxtaposed with jarring blasts of sound. The absence of any discernible meter, along with an ever-present potential for silence, encourages the listener to focus on overlapping and multivalent sounds as they live in their moment. Nono's incorporation of the term madrigal in the subtitle for a piece without a vocal component is revealed, as a sort of polyphony is projected between Kramer's recorded improvisations and the live violinist, a polyphony of past and present that opens up the possibility for the experience of a particular type of temporality. Madrigal characteristics are further evoked from the perspective of the performer, who must negotiate many expressive and technical directions. These directions are sometimes to be read vertically and at other times horizontally. The proposition that there are not only different modes of temporality, but also that these can coexist in perception resonates with Jonathan D. Kramer's exploration of the subject. J. Kramer considers time beyond a pre-existent objective measure of events, for example, the clock time around which most of us organize our schedules and conferences. Instead, time results from the way in which we connect a succession of events. In this framework, temporality in music becomes multivalent, subjective, dynamic, always dependent upon the way we make sense of the relationships we hear between sounds. J. Kramer posits various types of time, both linear and nonlinear, while conceding that, of course, all music will be linear to the extent that sonic events proceed in succession. One nonlinear species is called moment time, and is most commonly found in an atonal context. Following Stockhausen's moment form, moment time emerges from the type of event succession found in La Lontananza. In moment time, a piece does not truly begin or finish. Rather, it starts as if it had already been going on and we've simply happened to tune into it, and it ceases rather than ends. At the close of a work, the listener has the impression of having heard a series of minimally connected sections called moments that form a segment of an eternal continuum. Protracted silences also contribute to the discontinuity of moment time, particularly when applied outside of the teleology and functionality of a tonal framework. Constructing a piece in which autonomous moments are discontinuously presented highlights the significance of the instant, of being now and being complete, which Cacciari stressed in his readings of Rilke and Benjamin. Nono's direction that the tape element begin and end the work confirms the blurriness of beginnings and endings, and one can imagine the effect of the environmental sounds of Venice serving as an amorphous bookend to the experience of the performance. The reconstruction of mental categories that led to Nono's late work, including La Lontananza, resulted from his reflection on changing political exigencies. We would do well to keep in mind Nono's claim that, quote, the genuine idea of creative freedom is a consciously acquired capacity for identifying and facing up to the necessary demands of one's own time, end quote. As La Lontananza creates a series of autonomous moments in all their layering and multiplicity, we, as perceivers, may begin to question the putative linearity of history and delve deeper into the constellations of interrelated thought that have come to resonate with our current historical position. Thank you.
Put you on the spot a little bit with a question because first of all, I was amusing myself by trying to translate
Yeah.
La lontananza nostalgica utopica futura, right?
Yep.
Which I decided
Which
was
can be translated in a number of ways.
right,
It's
the
not.
nostalgic utopian future distance, maybe.
Mhm.
And I guess in my mind, I have this idea of that idea of the utopian future nostalgic distance, the peace, and the idea of the political.
Mhm.
And I'm struggling with the idea of the political in this piece, and I'm wondering. I think I am putting you on the spot.
No,
but
that's
can you,
yeah. I mean, a lot of people, that was like the turn that happens in 1980. A lot of people were approaching his music and say, okay, so Nono, you've flat out said that if we are to understand your music, we can't do it outside of a political context. Everything you're doing it's completely entrenched. And then from around 1980, he starts to write works like this, not like, Il Canto Sospeso, which was obviously very popular, or Intoleranza 1960, things that are much more clear-cut in their political engagement, right? For this, this turn is kind of signaling this idea that we need to broaden out. We need to look beyond ideology. We can't say that, we don't need to necessarily be hitting people over the head with it. The idea is for people to understand oppression in general, to change people's perceptions of things, rather than say, I adhere to this party or this idea, even though he was a communist from 1952. He's trying to be more inclusive, and the idea of being more inclusive without necessarily being explicitly attached to an ideology, I think this is what he comes up with, this idea of trying to channel the notion of perception of sound itself. And that's something that can be looked at. It's very interrelated. The techniques he's using here can be found in a lot of works, not put together in the same way, but I think that's what people and he identifies a shift as well. He's trying to say, it's, what do I do? Like, how can we get people aware of this without saying, you need to be explicitly, a communist, or you need to go into, let's say, a factory or something like that, and have a performance that way. This is his response to it. Sure.
Yeah, I wonder if I could push you to sort of define your own position with respect to Nono in this piece, because I couldn't quite tell if you were going a sort of route of exegesis or critique or some combination of the two.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could just kind of position yourself.
I guess more exegesis than critique. What I would say, I mean, I hear something like this, and the first thing I think is like already saying that as if you're using the most up-to-date technology to some degree in a certain way and focusing on perception, then that is in itself political. And then I ask myself, well, so if I make a series of sounds in any environment using the most recent technology, does that make it inherently political? Or, does that... and I'm not really sure I have an answer for that. I don't know, is this an effective way to get across some idea? I'm not really sure. I think what it can do is when you see the rest of this last 45 minutes, and what you saw is pretty much, their different stands have different, kind of themes and ideas, and so there is some kind of diversity. But you see a lot of people sitting there and reflecting and just kind of taking in this sound that's coming all over. And I don't know if that's going to, I don't know if I necessarily buy his argument that that's going to be necessarily political, even political in the way he wants it to be, right? So it's open-ended enough where maybe if you focus on perception, you can come up with ideas that he would absolutely abhor. That's totally possible as well. I guess I'm more interested in it in the sense of a response. This is one way that someone who is, obviously from the very far left is responding to what I think he sees as, its waning of a problem, of a crisis. The word crisis gets thrown around a lot by Cacciari and Nono. And so this is what he's deciding to do, and then we can compare it and contrast it to other responses and see, I would be difficult to gauge how effective it is and whatnot. But I think it's an idea, it's an interesting one to inspect. Cool. You got it.
You can leave it if you want. I'll just use that.
It doesn't matter to me.
Why don't you go ahead and use his and
Sure.
then
Seems
don't
good.
forget yours.
Sorry about that.
No, no problem. Thank you. Makes it
So while
convenient.
we're setting up, I will introduce the next.
Oops, good job.
You okay?
I'm fine.
Technology.
Yeah.
Alison MAGGART is a Bing Arnold Endowed Fellow at the University of Southern California. Her research interests include American constructions of musical identity, formalist aesthetics, and intertextual approaches to interpretation. She's currently working on her incredibly interesting sounding dissertation, I have to say, the aesthetic implications of allusions to the past in Babbitt's late works. Who knew? Which examine reference and quotation in Babbitt's works from the 80s and 90s.
Plug that in to quiet it. But, oh, oops.
There we go. Her paper today is Rhythmic Quotation in Milton Babbitt's The Virginal book.
So, in a panel discussion before the 2005 retrospective of Milton Babbitt's works at the Guggenheim, Babbitt stated, "The idea of words and music seemed to me to be most remarkably faced by the Elizabethans. I consider that age to be an absolutely extraordinary period of text setting, and much of what I do is consciously or unconsciously the result of their sense of rhythm, their sense of sonic rhythm. The only other people I know who paid as much attention to sound, the sound of words, the rhythm of the sound, the rhythm, the assonance, and every other form of sonic associations, both consonantal and verbal, is to be found in popular song lyrics of a certain sophistication. There's a particular example, which I'll never forget. There's a song of Jerome Kern, who's another one of my idols, a song called In Love in Vain." In this long passage, Babbitt indicates several concerns that I examine in this paper, taking the Virginal book, a work for voice and piano with text, by Babbitt's longtime collaborator John Hollander, as exemplary. First, I discuss the significance of rhythm in Babbitt's musical textual settings. Second, I note some of the correlations that Babbitt understood between Elizabethan and American popular music. And third, I argue that these associations reveal an aesthetic philosophy influenced by Hollander's intertextual theories. In the Virginal book, Babbitt sets Hollander's poem of the same name from Hollander's 1986 In Time and Place, a collection of prose and poems that meditate on the theme of absence. "Slowly I play through Loath to Depart" by Farnaby, the now in tune piano saves from my rough-hewn graces and runs, the fragile art of varying a common theme while keeping on familiar ground. Mine based on lost I have not found, what variation might redeem. So these divisions weep out woe, a false relation here and there, a sharp pain after natural care, from whose plain text these fancies grow. Hollander's frequent reference to music, to a piano performance, Farnaby, false relations, sharps and naturals, themes and variations, divisions and grounds, all these make the text an apt choice for a musical setting. And though one might expect Babbitt to abstain from setting such references literally, he in fact realizes each of Hollander's musical allusions. Babbitt prepares us for the anachronistic music-text relationships in the Virginal book by opening the composition with a sustained D-flat major triad. Because this triad belongs to a musical grammar that Babbitt deserted, it sounds disruptive, and thus constitutes what Robert Hatton would deem a marked event. In confounding expectation, it draws attention to the gap between historical and contemporary musical languages, rather than fade into the normative atonal harmonic space of the serial idiom. Its presence is magnified. Positioned at the outset of the composition, Babbitt's major triad also frames the context through which we should listen to the entire work. Indeed, this single triad gives way to the most overt borrowing, to my knowledge, in any Babbitt composition. As the voice sings, "Slowly I play through loath to depart," her rhythm matches exactly that of the theme carried in the soprano voice of the virginalist Giles Farnaby's "Loath to Depart," found in the Fitzwilliam Virginal book. Babbitt is able to accomplish this quotation because rather than articulate line pairs in the vocal part solely by register, as typical in his practice, in the Virginal book, Babbitt correlates the line pairs to register and dynamic levels. This permits, among other things, that the rhythmic parameter can be dictated by other means, suggesting that the quotation was part of the pre-compositional plan of the Virginal book. More than just quote the loath rhythm, Babbitt's setting also enacts the full textual line, "Slowly I play through loath to depart." Babbitt's deployment of musical material creates the impression of a literally lagging singer. Our perception of the vocalist's slow performance is the result of several factors. First, the vocal quotation is drawn out over the course of 4 measures, suggesting Farnaby's mensuration in 3, typically translated as 6/4 in modern notation. Second, the uneven rate at which the vocal and piano parts complete their respective aggregates contributes to the sense that the singer is failing to match the pace of the pianist. For example, though by the end of the second measure the piano has exhausted 9 of the total 12 pitches in its first aggregate, the vocal line has only completed 3 of her 12 pitches. In fact, as the singer lingers over the word "slowly," the piano rushes ahead, forecasting the rest of the loath rhythm in diminution. The pitches are the same too. Third, as the voice continues, the piano is forced to stall, repeating the same pitches in order to coordinate aggregate boundaries. This is typical of Babbitt's practice. Thus, it sounds like the piano is waiting for the vocalist to catch up. She finally seems to become aware of her leisurely pace in measure 6 when she sings a series of triplet eighth notes. The effect of this shift is that after the vocalist slowly quotes the Farnaby rhythm, she doubles her speed in order to match the piano. The meaning of "slowly" for the audience is thus multiplied, describing not only Hollander's narrator, who plays through loath to depart slowly, but also the performer of the Virginal book, who, seeming to sing behind the pianist, performs the slowness described in the text. Despite the transparency of this initial quotation, hearing it requires knowledge of a specific repertory that remains unknown to the general public, as well as it entails the ability to recognize the loath rhythm without its pitch context, which is arguably more difficult than recognizing a melody in a new rhythmic context. So, why has Babbitt chosen the rhythm? In his book, The Untuning of the Sky, Hollander describes English Renaissance poets' penchant for excessive references to music as an outgrowth of a specific conception of the ideal prosody. Elizabethan poets, guided by Renaissance idealizations of Greek art and culture, maintained an ideological connection between poetry and music. Believing poetry and music to have been undifferentiated during Greek times and to have only recently become separated, a division worthy of weeping out woe, Hollander describes how Renaissance theorists undertook a broad and ambitious program whose aim was to return both arts to their classical original, almost as it came to be felt, prelapsarian union. Part of this program involved redefining poetic form so as to underscore its heritage as an abstraction from, or residue of, musical form. Thus advocating for formal imitations of classical meters, Renaissance theorists appropriated terminology such as iambic, dactylic, etc., derived from Greek scansion based on quantitative long and short syllables for the accented and unaccented syllables of the English language. The metrical framework now in place, English prosodists were able to compose musical poetry. According to Hollander, the music of poetry resides in both the non-semantic patterns of linguistic redundancy as well as in the tension between poetic meter, the formal scheme of the poem, which in the Virginal book is an iambic tetrameter, and rhythm, the overlaid accentual pattern of individual words or phrases that may or may not conform to the meter. Indeed, it is actually in this, Hollander claims, the variation occurring when individual and particular rhythms depart from the metrical pattern, that poetry lives. Babbitt's setting of the Virginal book is sensitive to the poem's rhythmic and metrical conflicts, allowing them to play out in the natural declamation of the text, in the work's shifting meters, as well as in the coordination of aggregate boundaries and poetic line. Consequently, even if the literal quotation of Farnaby in the opening line goes unrecognized, one hears a magnification of Hollander's poetic, metrical, rhythmic interplay, meant to evoke 16th century musical poetry. For example, scanning the rhythm of the first vocal line, "Slowly I play through loath to depart," we find that Babbitt underscores the metrical ambiguity of slowly by locating slow on the downbeat and by maintaining even rhythmic values for each syllable. It is not until later that the poem's underlying iambic meter emerges as the result of both the agogic accents Babbitt imposes on the stressed syllables, a seeming literal equation of quantitative value with accentual emphasis, as well as the correlation Babbitt draws between the stressed syllables and the downbeats. Play, loathe, and depart are sustained for relatively long durations, as well as coincide with the strongest musical beats. The poetic foot is thus at first equated to the musical measure. Thus, when in the second line of the stanza, by Farnaby, the now in tune, the stressed accents fall on each musical beat, not just the downbeats, our sense that the vocalist had been performing a particularly slow rendition of Farnaby's tune is further amplified, the poetic foot now being equated to the musical beat. Occasionally, however, Babbitt honors the semantic meaning of the text at the expense of the prosodic rhythm. For example, the musical setting of "From My Rough Hewn" contradicts the iambic meter in that unstressed syllables occur on the musical beats. The performance in the poem is not the only thing roughly hewn. The composer's setting of the text is roughly hewn too. Or in one final example, Babbitt departs from setting stressed syllables on musical beats in the line, "So these divisions weep out woe." Weep transpires half a beat late, producing a slight drag or hiccup. And this hiccup, in conjunction with the delayed and long durations of out woe, is perhaps meant to imitate the gasping and hesitant parole of a weeping woman. The incredible nuance and care with which Hollander and Babbitt echo Elizabethan practices suggests that Renaissance music and poetry embodied specific ideals that they believed relevant to contemporary aesthetic debates. In particular, the value Renaissance theorists placed in the perfect interdimensional formal unity. However, we might yet wonder why the most specific Renaissance reference is to Farnaby, an untrained musician whose musical output is described as uneven at best. And yet, the reference to Farnaby in the Virginal book ties Hollander's poem, and consequently Babbitt's music, into a particular intertextual historiography. For the Farnaby tune has a long history of literary citation, appearing, for example, in 4 different Shakespeare plays. Such a referential lineage was significant to Hollander, who, in his book The Figure of Echo, argued that an artwork's referential repleteness was correlated to its meaning and artistic value. In the book, Hollander outlines an aesthetic theory of allusion and reference, in which the metaleptic echo is proposed as a watermark of poetic excellence. Just as sound resonates more powerfully in an echo, Hollander argues that poetic meaning accumulates in each successive generation of artists' references to the past. Such a conception allows Hollander not only to eschew notions of contemporary art's exhaustion, but also to reinforce the value of dense and complex works. The more to which a work alludes, the richer its own meanings, and by proximity its value. Indeed, for Hollander, the metaphoric density of a work, the accretion of meaning enacted by each successive trope in a series of allusions, is an evaluative property, reinforcing the significance of highly complex and formalized artworks. Hollander's allusion to Farnaby is thus part of an aesthetic project. The reference not only conjures association with a long and highly regarded tradition of English verse, Hollander's narrator's slow pondering over the tune also expresses Hollander's reflections on the history of the song and its usage. His poor divisions now seem also to represent Hollander's humble attempt to partake in that tradition. Moreover, Hollander's narrator's performance of the antiquated tune on a piano, not a virginal, reverberates with recent literature. In James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, a work admired by both Hollander and Babbitt, the protagonist Stephen plays Farnaby's tune on a piano. The scene in which the reference occurs directly precedes the most explicit statement of Joyce's aesthetic philosophy, wherein Stephen voices, "Art is beheld by the intellect. The aesthetic image is first luminously apprehended as self-bounded and self-contained. You apprehend its wholeness, then you apprehend it as a balanced part against part within its limits. You feel the rhythm of its structure." After expounding such theories of formal unity, Stephen returns home, composes an archaic villanelle, and dreams of playing Loath to Depart on a piano for his beloved. Like Babbitt's antiquated opening triad and Hollander's obsolete poetic meter and rhyme scheme in the Virginal book, the anachronistic style of Stephen's villanelle is marked. The poem thus is not to be taken uncritically. Rather, it is a symbol of Joyce's proposed aesthetics based on formal relationships, the importance of the intellect in aesthetic appreciation, and the self-boundedness of great artworks. Similarly, Hollander's narrator's poor piano playing and Babbitt's roughly hewn setting, paralleling Stephen's trite poetry, is not to be taken seriously. This is a pretense made even more absurd by the audience recognition that the supposedly poor piano player is in fact performing a work by Babbitt, known for being notoriously difficult. Rather, these aspects of the Virginal book are meant to refocus our attention, like Stephen's poems, on the values they embody. Hence, we come to find that the allusion in the Virginal book is not an allusion to Farnaby at all, but rather an echo and affirmation of the aesthetic commitments that Joyce, Hollander, and Babbitt shared. In this reading, the concluding lines of the Virginal book, "From whose plain text these fancies grow," also appear to reference Joyce. The plain text is Hollander's poem, Stephen's villanelle and Joyce's artist. The fancies are Babbitt's variations, Stephen's fantasized recital, Elizabethan fantasias, and for Babbitt, perchance, associated with musical improvisations of a very different kind. During the 20th century, American cultural capital was frequently constructed by correlating American to English artistic practices. Curiously, critics and composers often drew comparison between the irregular rhythms of American popular music, specifically jazz, and Elizabethan music. Such comparisons were on the one hand, particularly during the post-war period, motivated by a desire to undermine the historical significance of German music, which traditionally employed straight rhythms, as well as to, on the other hand, draw American, African-inspired rhythms into the same aesthetic sphere as music from the European continent. The music of Jerome Kern exemplifies the ideological convergence of American jazz and Elizabethan musical practices. Kern regarded early English songwriters as his predecessors, a fact of which Babbitt was well aware, labeling his choruses in his songs burdens or burthens as early as 1917. Kern also insisted that his lyricists refer to the chorus of his songs as burthens and made sure that burthen was notated in published sheet music. Some scholars argue that this idiosyncrasy demonstrates Kern's desire to situate his music within the lineage of high art forms, and yet it is more often than not seen as a goal that Kern failed to realize. As James Randall notes, Kern's label is no more than a self-consciously pretentious attempt at cleverness, more than practical musical direction. For Babbitt, Kern's use of the term burden instead of chorus, one, testifies to Kern's composerly ambitions to unify his songs. Indeed, Babbitt claims Kern's song In Love in Vain endures because its lyrics are comprised of the most fluid fit of any words to a Kern melody. And two, it indicates the artistic distance Kern sought to achieve from his peers' choruses. According to Babbitt's interpretation, then, Kern's archaism ensured a self-imposed artistic isolation, for only those with a specific knowledge of historical musical terms can appreciate Kern's use of the word burthen, and by this Kern gained an implied significance. This position, of course, reflects Babbitt's artistic agenda just as much, if not more so, than it describes Kern's. For Babbitt interprets Kern's eccentricity in order to support and correlate his popular music taste to a larger aesthetic program that valued insularity and, most importantly, formal unity. For Babbitt, Hollander, Joyce, and Kern, as understood by Babbitt at least, the Renaissance symbolized an era that succeeded in forging music and poetry into a perfect formal accord. Moreover, as a representation more than a historical past, the Elizabethan era thus manifests in the Virginal book as an inverted image of Hollander's and Babbitt's presence, as an object that sustains the aesthetic values they found absent in their own worlds. And so when Hollander and Babbitt alluded to the era, either through stylistic reference or literal quotation, they meant to excavate and reinstate the aesthetic ideals that the Elizabethan era represented. Just as the Elizabethan poets sought to dissolve the woeful division between music and poetry, Hollander and Babbitt sought to diminish the perceived divisions between contemporary dichotomies such as thought and feeling, form and content, science and art. As Babbitt confessed to Bruce Duffy in an interview, "When I see that dichotomy between thinking and feeling, I can't make anything of it. Because you feel about something because you've thought about it. You feel about something because you understand it. I just can't accept that dichotomy at all between heart and mind, or the sentient and the cognitive, between the intellectual and the emotional. It's all one complex human being that's involved. You're doing all these things in the most intricate kind of interrelationship." In this way, we should be encouraged to go beyond strict analysis of Babbitt's music, the form and strict analysis of the music, the form, and the intellectual components of Babbitt's works in interpretation, for these aspects represent only half of the interrelationships present in the music. Are we not yet weary of such analytical ways? Indeed, the poetry, content, and emotional capacity of Babbitt's music are still, I think, underrepresented in the theoretical literature, and yet these aspects are inextricably interrelated to the work's formal dimensions, as well as indispensable to the work's meanings. They are the fancies flowering from the plain text. Thank you.
I was wondering if you had any knowledge of maybe what recordings of Elizabethan music Babbitt would have listened to?
I don't. And I don't know, other than asking his daughter, how I would even get that, because I've basically looked through everything else. No, I don't know what he would have been listening to.
Because the Elizabethans were really quite popularly recorded by
Right.
New York Musica,
Mm-hmm.
and they had very
And-
rhythmic performances.
And they were doing lots of weird, like, jazz
Yeah.
recreations. I don't know what he was listening to, though. Short answer, sorry.
I have a couple of questions. First of all, I would love to hear about other pieces, if you don't mind, where Babbitt is referencing older music, because this is, it's sort of a revelation to me, and I'd like to know sort of how widespread and whether there's a typology of the ways that he references or refers.
There are quite a lot. Most references, at least as they appear in scholarship, are attached to these homage works.
Right.
So there's this whole component where he might, for example, my compliments to Roger, which is for Roger Sessions, starts with a quotation of the musical offering, the notes. That would be one example. In his own word, and then Don, for Don Martino, has a Don trichord in it. In terms of referencing older music, there are lots, especially starting from the 70s, even in Elizabethan sextet, 3 cultivated choruses. There's one really interesting article by Peter Schubert about three cultivated choruses that connects this half-step motive to Monteverdi's sort of descending, sad motives. Otherwise, it's not really out there. There's My Ends Are My Beginnings, which is structurally related to Ma fin et ma commencement, but mostly I would say it's Renaissance that he's alluding to, or Schoenberg, transfigured notes. It's another piece.
Right.
So
Yeah. Schoenberg makes sense.
Schoenberg makes sense, but then there are lots that are going towards this earlier period too that he doesn't actually say that much about. One thing he does say, other than what I've read today, he has Soli in Duettini, which is Italian, but then in his program notes for that he says, I have really no affiliation with Italian music, as I do English. They're very obscure, but this piece to me is just, and if we were talking about the pitches at all, there are literal variations that are very, very clear in this piece. Musical variations, lots of text setting. Plain text is the only part of the piece that has no musical accompaniment. Mine based on loss. The piano part goes to extreme registers and then sustain there. So it's this big empty registral space. I mean, harmonically, this piece is fascinating too. It literally gets into tune. When he says in tune, it goes up a half step from where it has been the whole time.
So this is like 16th century madrigalism.
Yeah, so much of this is. These pieces, I don't think they get much, there's not much interest because they do start later in his career when a lot of people are kind of over doing a lot of the strict formal analysis that they associate with Babbitt. And also they're shorter pieces. They tend to be shorter pieces. So people say, oh, they're not serious. They're just miniatures.
So I have another question. Is part of this his interest in Renaissance English, sort of highfalutin, if I can use that term? Is there kind of a self-fashioning thing going on? I mean, in other words, is he associating himself with sort of high culture of the English past in order to sort of make an intellectual claim about his own?
As far as associating himself with any sort of past, that's pretty much entirely Schoenberg. And he doesn't say that he's related to this. What I think it has to do with is his relationship with John Hollander. He and John Hollander, they started together on Philomel. And then Babbitt sent many of Hollander's poems throughout his career. And whenever he did, they would correspond. And Hollander would send pages of analyses of his poems, and he would describe how they're so perfectly interrelated, the metric structure, and then what certain words mean and how these allude to this huge list of different things. And Hollander's interest was much more in English poetry, obviously of this time, and I think that his interest got Babbitt interested in it more than Babbitt necessarily saying, I'm going to associate myself with this tradition. When he's associating himself with any sort of tradition, it tends to be mostly structurally, and he starts talking about his pieces in terms of glosses and how they're glossing Schoenberg and these kind of things. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you thought there was any relationship between his penchant to look to the past and his developing of his musical language. So in other words, is it towards the beginning you have trichordales, right, and he's going into mosaics, and then the time point system kind of emerges too.
Right.
Do you think there's any type of, once he comes to develop someplace in his style, is he more inclined to look behind or less?
Mostly, I mean, it certainly he becomes more, he has more allusions, more references to the past, the late past, later in his work. And I mean, you can just look at the titles and kind of get an idea of this. It starts out composition for instruments, composition for viola and piano, and then it becomes all of a sudden the joy of more sextets and World Series and the Virgil book, My End and My Beginnings, and all these pieces that already are suggesting that we look back. This is a super array piece. I think as he develops more complex structure, it in fact becomes easier in some ways to manipulate and get these illusions. Because, for example, in this piece, that a triad, a major triad, is not part of the serial structure. It's not automated in any way by a serial structure, as say in Berg when he's getting these triads. They're in the row. This is not in the row. In fact, this row is associated with jazz. It's the same, or one of the rows. The vocal part is related to this hexachord that he thought of as jazz and from Alset. But as it gets more and more complex, more and more lines happening, then you can manipulate the lines or slow them down so as to project whatever you want on the musical surface. You're most automated when you have the most simple structure. If you have only one voice that can only do, one transformation at a time, then you do come closer to sort of machine spitting out of rows. When you have a very complex structure, you can really create anything. I think that's part of his agenda in some ways, is to demonstrate that a very complex system in fact encapsulates all the music of the past and sort of is the underlying kind of like ultra matrix almost to the past, because the matrix is really just hypothetical. You can pull anything out of it if you have enough lines and time. So that's what I think.
Thank you very much.
Do you need this? Oh, we've got it.
Our last speaker this session is Max NOUBEL, who's lecturer at the University of Burgundy in Bourgogne and research affiliate of the Centre de Recherche sur les Arts et le Langage. He works on 20th century American music and has published articles on Ives, Carter, Riley, and Wright, among others. His book, Elliott Carter, Le Temps Fertile, won the Prix de Muse in 2001 for the best musical biography published that year. His most recent book is the edited collection Hommage à Elliott Carter, which collects essays prepared for that composer's 100th birthday. He will speak to us today about Adams's post-stylistic interpretations of the past, a response to the uncertain future of a globalized world?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very honored and a little impressed to lecture on an American composer in New York. During the 1980s, John Adams composed works strongly influenced by repetitive minimalism. But from Harmony to his most recent works, he has gradually emancipated from this minimalist model and has built his musical thought in a dynamic and inventive approach of the past. This artistic evolution has led commentators to place John Adams within the sphere of postmodernism, but he refuses to accept that he belongs to this sphere, preferring the notion of post-stylism. Going beyond the notion of style would enable Adams to escape from modernism orthodoxies, which can certainly enable the artist to achieve fame through the original character of his or her creation, but only lead to isolation or confinement within cliques. This anti-progressivist vision has earned him the label of reactionary composer. But for Adams, the idea has to be accepted that a composer can no longer envisage creation with ingenuity, innocence, or virginity. So this postmodern conception attempts to find its place in an increasingly globalized world in which the speed of transport has abolished distances between the most remote places on the planet, where immense digital storage capacities have the potential to access the entire history of civilizations and culture. But the geographical space from which Adams draws his musical inspirations remains contained within the Western world. He even claims to be an American composer who fully assumes the cultural pluralism of his country and its strong bonds with old Europe. John Adams' historical musical influences are relatively limited, even though it is clear that they have been considerably extended over the decades. To date, the music of Bach, whose passion inspired the gospel according to the Second Mary, and of Handel, whose Messiah inspired El Niño and his most distant incursion into the past. His influences are in fact mainly concentrated on the Romantic period, but also leave room from the great figures of the 20th century. This vision of the history of music combines with some popular types of music such as jazz, rock, and pop music. However, it could be argued that, in spite of Adams' reticence, this post-stylistic position does express a postmodern attitude. Indeed, it abandons the idea of the constant search for progress in art. What is more, by this absence of belief in modernity, this position seems to justify the use of multiple and fragmented paths, serving as raw material for a work of recreation that is necessarily distanced. The value of artwork would then only be relative because of the collapse of artistic hierarchies, caused mainly by the commodification of art on a worldwide scale. This is a sore point for art music composition, attempting to survive in a world village where the immense power of the media and market forces tend to homogenize tastes and ways of thinking. It should be said that John Adams' ability to resist such artistic uniformity has been brought into doubt, as you can read, of course. Part of the critics were tempted to believe in his corruptibility in the 1980s, judging from the negative reception of some of his works. His first opera, Nixon in China, is a straightforward combination of noble and popular genres, as well as barely veiled references to music of the past. He had been perceived as proof of the composer's complacency with regard to American consumerism, in particular because of the simplification of the clearly tonal musical language. In Nixon in China and in Grand Pianola music, references to the past emerge from a minimalist sound fabric in oversimplified forms, which seems to testify an ironic vision of prestigious models. For certain critics, these models are henceforth deprived of any substance and reduced to easily exportable consumables in a world heading towards standardized cultural practices, still conveyed by a form of American imperialism. But it is not the case with John Adams' music. This assumed simplicity has been taken a little too quickly for demagogic facility, masking an absence of inspiration. In fact, it was a deeper question of a redefinition of aesthetic criteria and of the functionalities of musical language, which always preserved a total conscience of the value of artwork. In Grand Planula music, Adams clearly alludes to the Emperor Concerto. The cascade of arpeggios played by the two pianos, which can be heard in the second movement, are also a reminder of music from the very kiss show of the American musical pianist Liberace. And the only melodic theme of the work resembles a hymn as much as a popular tune. Just the beginning. But the discourse is completely regenerated by the way John Adams starts from neutral minimalist material formed of repeated patterns, then gradually releases this rigid process with the emphatic introduction of heterogeneous material that he does not hesitate to call detritus. For example, the major or minor triad played at full strength by the brass, which in the second movement seem to evoke the rise of the gods in the Valhalla, are much simpler chord sequences than those found in Wagner's operas. By this harmonic simplification, Adams avoids creating a kind of stylistic hiatus with the minimalist context, but he also avoids limiting the works to a simple pastiche. Thus, by a very subtle loosening of the minimalist corset, the past is reborn in a completely extrovert manner with a freshness of expression that is literally unprecedented. In her aria, I Am the Wife of Mao Zedong, in the second act of the opera Nixon in China, chanting is a sort of Brunhilde without the mystery or psychological subtleties of Wagner's music. It's rather like Mona Lisa taken by Roche Lichtenstein, straight from a comic with none of the mystery of the landscape that surrounds the portrait. Here too, in the context of this theater and the theater scene, in which the Nixon couple attend a pure propaganda show, the music, harmonically very simple, appears to be the archetype of the cold and triumphant power of totalitarianism. It is no longer seen through the prism of the Germanic romanticism of the late 19th century, but through a contemporary mind that has completely assimilated and clarified its expressive and stylistic substance to transmute it into a sound universe that has been completely removed. The minimalism, which carried grammatical simplification within itself, was a good way for Adams to gradually integrate elements of the past and allow their expressive power to enter the music without undergoing the obsolescence of their musical grammar. Harmonie Lheureux is a good illustration of this approach. The work makes explicit reference to Schoenberg's Harmony book, but it is in no way a second reading of this treatise. I would be tempted to say that this it is a counter-reading, a way of accepting the right to make changes of tonality very freely with simple triad, without following the rules of modulation. Harmonie Lehre already had the particular feature of reintroducing the expressive melodic intensity of Romanticism without creating it from a hyper-modulating harmonic language. On the contrary, the lengthy melodic that unfold in the first movement are reminders of Mahler or Wagner, but it cannot be said that the music is turning its back on the contemporary era, because the musical workmanship is so original and so far from the language of these composers. This approach is not in contradiction with Adams' fascination for the harmonic subtlety of the great Romantic composers. Besides which, in its second opera, The Death of Klinghoffer, he took inspiration from post-Romantic Romanticism in a very free and personal way. But for Adams, this heritage, like others, is no longer the special reserve for the highbrow culture sphere, but can be found, for example, in the great tradition of American popular song, magnified by Gershwin or Cole Porter. So Adams fully accepts the fact that he is a link in a chain of successive assimilations subject to phenomena of hybridization and change, which have been facilitated by transoceanic cultural exchanges in the past. It is interesting to note that with his chamber symphony, Adams preserves a certain harmonic simplicity, but he manages to transform the very Germanic expressionist tension of Schoenberg's eponymous model, the Kammersymphony No. 1, into an hyperactive score inspired by American cartoons of the 1950s. What is more, the music of the first movement, sometimes irresistibly recalls Stravinsky's L'Histoire du Soldat. The two great antagonistic figures of the modern music from the first half of the 20th century cohabit here in the most natural way because of the perfect assimilation of the respective styles. The evolution of Adams' music outside the minimalist straitjacket was accompanied by greater musical sophistication. It was marked in particular by the significant development of a very elaborate polyphonic and polyrhythmic writing. This complexification of the musical language must not be taken as a qualitative improvement of John Adams' music. It is the particularly coherent evolution of a demanding and independent creative journey. John Adams has always refused to make a distinction between the noble and the commonplace, but it is never intended for him to give up the aspiration of a highly elaborated but accessible art. This fundamental aspect of Adams' creative approach would need to be studied in depth, but here I will treat to the recent reactivation of Beethoven's music as a model and source of his inspiration. In his first string quartet, John Adams does not make any textual quotation. What is Beethovenian in his work, in particular in the first movement, does not appear at the surface of the music. It is to be found at the structural and organic level in the dialectical relations maintained by two types of music of a different, even antagonistic nature. One is clearly of minimalist inspiration. The other is more lyrical and expressive. The different relations between these two types of music are not associated with a particular musical style. They draw freely from styles different from Beethoven's, without using textual quotations either. Thus, music of a rather minimalist nature can, for example, evoke Ravel or Reich, while that of a more lyrical nature can evoke Brahms or elsewhere Sibelius. Two examples. Minimalist inspiration. And now the influence of the Romantics. Little like Brahms. Adam's interest in Beethoven's late quartets was confirmed with the composition of Absolute Jest for string quartet and orchestra, and his very recent second string quartet. Unlike the first quartet, in these two pieces, Adams explicitly refers to the music of Beethoven. In Absolute Jest, the quotations come from the scherzo of the Ninth Symphony, which is here a kind of backbone of the orchestral part. The quotations also come from fragments of scherzi from the late string quartets. What especially interests Adams here is capturing the particular energy of the Beethovenian scherzo and combining it with the energy inherent in his own music. He is also interested in creating a work that transmutes the musical material of the Beethovenian quartet into a sound that is also particular to himself. As for Pulcinella, where Pergolesi sounds like Stravinsky, Beethoven sounds here like John Adams. It could therefore be said that Adams' music is based on the oxymoron of plural unicity. Indeed, its coherence and its deep originality are to be found in the way it absorbs and digests the great diversity of the Western style to regenerate their power of expression without debasing the material and without remaining at the surface of things, that is to say, at the manipulation or collage of lost property. According to me, this is how his music succeeds in touching the very heart of the multicultural and multiform conscience of a considerably enlarged community of listeners. The music of John Adams shows us that in that open world village, so culturally interpenetrated, the uses of a past, near or more remote, no longer necessarily need to be as ostentatious and sometimes militant as they were in the 1960s or 70s. References to the past have circulated and acted in many ways in all the cultural spheres, from commercial pop music to experimental and independent music. Today, historicism that Frederick Jameson calls the cannibalization of the past no longer has any real reason to worry. Without claiming that it has a universal impact that would be ridiculous in a globalized world in perpetual change, John Adams' music could be a way of touching the collective cultural conscience of this Western sphere, which is culturally as variable as it is extensible. But it could also touch a part of its collective cultural subconscious. But I'll just give one example which is not influenced by the music of Beethoven. Maddy's Gin, the second movement of Century Roll, makes one irresistibly think to the slow movement of Maurice Ravel J Major Concerto, even if it refers to Erik Satie Gymnopédies. But what Adams managed to do here goes beyond attachment to imitation or pastiche. It is more about the extremely subtle creation of an ineffable and maybe partly unconscious feeling in the listener of going to the very heart of a certain spirit of French music. A feeling aroused by the transparency of the sound texture and the slightly melancholic delicacy of the melodic lines. Each listener will feel in his or her own way this ineffable feeling, depending on detailed or superficial or even fantasized knowledge of this French spirit. But this central movement is framed by two movements which are completely foreign to this spirit. Indeed, they refer more clearly to the American piano music and its extrovert nature, full of rhythmic vitality. But the very subtle way that John Adams has of representing this aspect of the American musical soul is not content with playing at a superficial level. He is playing here in a very subtle way on something more ineffable, which could belong to this subconscious, or this collective cultural imaginary that clearly goes beyond the frontiers of North America. If John Adams manages to do that remarkably, it is because his concept of post-stylism enables him to create a multiplicity of facets of a representation, itself led to coexist with other representation, equally composed of multiple facets. All these ephemeral moments create networks of senses and suggestion that are much more effective because they are able to touch the own culture of every listener at many levels. Thus, an original way of conceiving the value of a work could be defined which, thanks to what we could call the plasticity of its historical genome, would allow us to opt for its survival in a globalized and uncertain world. Thank you very much. seems to me that, sorry,
Yes.
there is an important difference between Babbitt and for example, John Adams, the question of accessibility of the music. For Babbitt, the audience, it's not a problem. He don't care this question. But for Adams, it's different. Because it was for me the same question, the same problem than those of, for example, Ellington. Ellington wanted to be recognized by the sphere of the art music. It's the same problem with Babbitt and also with John Adams, but John Adams want to overtake the question of the style and the question of the popular and art music. So the fundamental question is the audience. John Adams accepts to be a popular composer, even if he has the image of a corrupted composer. For Babbitt, it's impossible to accept this position, it seems to me. It's the same problem for Elliott Carter.
I wonder though, I mean, yes, I agree that the audiences are different. But even so, I wonder what sort of public really can understand even these pieces as referring to certain Beethoven scherzi versus just old-sounding classical music. I think a lot of the audience still would maybe, not recognize quotations, even though they might be the most blatant or sort of masterworks from the past. Or even the distinction between romantic sounding versus somebody saying, oh, this is John Williams again, which is romantic, but misplacing the quotations that Adams was using.
The problem and the fundamental question is, what is the sense of a quotation?
Mm-hmm.
It is an ironic gesture. It is a way to destructure the music, or more, is it a new way to transform the material? For example, it seems to me that John Adams is close to Luciano Berio, but not the Sinfonia, because Sinfonia is a kind of history of music, of orchestral music, but it's close to the Chemin, which are kind of concerti from with the soloist is in fact the part of the sequenza, and it transforms the material of the sequenza in an orchestral form. That is very interesting, but because the quotation is never literal. The question of transformation of the process and the material of the music. Excuse me, I have now full English.
I think that it goes even beyond that. And when you talk about quotation, it's what, how, and to what effect. And in the framework of our conference, the question is, is the fact really a fact that historicizes? Because if quotation simply means historicizing because one takes some old material, then we can expand this to every single period where composers have quoted.
Yes. Hmm.
So I think that we need to look deeper on what the effects are of quotation and the means and deconstruct them.
Yes. The question of the style is for me more important. I can be a little provocative. If you listen to Don Giovanni, in fact, we can consider that it is a postmodern work, because it's just a synthesis of the music of the past, because he composed in the style of Handel, for example, in the Elvire aria. So it's kind of postmodern position. What is a postmodern attitude? If I quote a work before me,
Well, I mean, you're looking at me because I made a face.
no, it's a little provocative,
No,
of
no,
course.
it's great. I mean, I would say he's not quoting Handel or even he's using the genre of the virtuosic opera seria aria, which was still current in the 1780s, to critique his own character. Right? I mean, he's poking fun at his own his character.
He critiques so. It's a little ironic.
It's
so
sure it's ironic.
a little,